Well, good morning and welcome to all of those who've joined us already for this BSAC 2021 Incident Report webinar. Just to remind you that could you please make sure, I think we've pretty much got that anyway, that your microphones stay on mute and your videos are switched off during the course of this morning's event. Any questions you have to raise, please would you raise those via the chat, and I'll be monitoring that during the morning and pick up any questions from you for Jim. So I'll welcome this morning Jim Watson, who is the Diving Safety and Incident Advisor for the British-Sub-Aqua Club, who's going to present this morning's session. And Jim is with us now. Jim has been looking after the incident reports, effectively took over since about 2013, and he's been doing that with the team. And I'll hand over to Jim to start the session rolling. Over to you, Jim.
So what I'm going to cover this morning is, first of all, some thanks. Thanks to everyone who's taken the time and effort and honesty to submit incident reports in many formats. If people didn't take that time and effort, then we wouldn't have the resource that we've got. And in addition to that, some thanks to the other organisations that contribute to that, so the MCA, RNLI, other rescue agencies, including ROSPA, and in particular our colleagues in Ireland in CFT, the Irish Underwater Council, that have been submitting all of their incident reports in recent years, which led to us adding in all island incidents within regardless of agency, and we get contributions from other diving organisations that are active in the UK, and reports from inland dive sites as well. So that all of that contributes to the level of reporting that most of you will probably have seen in the published incident report. Also, thanks to one of my colleagues, Ben Peddy, who helps tremendously with the statistical analysis of the data and the extraction of the data into the report, which saves an awful lot of time and effort from when we used to do it largely manually. And Ben's mother, Claire, who also helps, continues to help support me in compiling the report. And finally, thanks to Ron Evans and Alison Dando for proofing this year's report. I'm going to briefly mention as we start the effects of the COVID pandemic, just to provide some context to this year's report and relate back to last year's in particular. And then we'll review much of the data, speak about the various graphs and everything that you'll have seen in the report, and draw some inferences from that. And then finish off with some advice on how to utilise the incident report to help make diving safer in new clubs. And summarise with the conclusions from the 2021 incident reporting year. And then at the end of that, there'll be an opportunity for you to have the questions that you may have raised answered. And as John said at the beginning, if you've got any questions that you want to raise about the details that we're covering, then please put it in the chat. And John will be keeping a track on that, and we'll ask those questions at the end and answer as many of them as we realistically can in the time that we've got. Can I just remind everybody once again to keep the videos switched off? It helps with the bandwidth. There's quite a lot of people still to join. So if it crashes the system, it doesn't help. So better if you can keep your video cameras off, switched off, please. So in terms of incidents by year, a reminder that our incident reporting year changed in 2018 to cover the reporting period from the 1st of January through to the end of December each year. And between 2014 and 2018, what we saw is a leveling off of the number of reported incidents to around about 250 a year. And then in 2019, what we saw was, excuse me, stepped on too far, a spike in that, which we attributed to a year of particularly good diving weather. We speculated at that time whether or not it would be a blip, and difficult to be sure on that, because what happened, as we all know, is 2020, the figures dropped considerably, but we're pretty sure we know the reason for that, unfortunately. And that significantly fewer incidents was reflected in, so the red columns here are the average number of incidents per month that we saw between 2015 and 2019, and then the blue columns are what happened in 2020. And so early part of the year, fairly January, February, and to a lesser extent March, was more or less in line, but then a very sudden drop, and that was when we started getting the major impacts of the COVID pandemic, when all activity pretty much stopped, and that had a significant influence. And last year's report focused quite a bit on that. But what we've seen this year is a subsequent rise back to more or less the similar levels that we were seeing between 2014 and 2019. So what we recorded was 235 incidents entered into the database, and of those 218, which is the column that's shown here, were UK incidents, which is sports diving incidents of all affiliations. So it's not restricted just to BSAC. It includes all agencies and any reports that we get notification of that occur in UK waters. By sports diving, what it excludes is any commercial activities, unless those commercial activities are recreational diving, the training of recreational divers commercially. So it would exclude scallop diving, offshore oil industry, and that kind of thing. It also, the year includes 17 overseas incidents where either there is some involvement of BSAC members, not necessarily the casualty in the incident, but some involvement, or any incident that we get notification of that occurs in the whole of area, and that's because of our association with the CFT and the contribution that they're making. And part of the reason for that is that the water conditions are comparable to what we get in the rest of the UK, so that there's a value in recording that information. And so what, as I've already said, we've got a return close to the previous trend, in line with the easing of COVID restrictions and the return to diving activity. And so looking at the distribution of incidents, more or less the opposite of what we saw in 2020, where the early part of the year we were heavily involved in the third lockdown. there was very restricted activity. But once we got to April and the restrictions started to ease again, we had a return to more normal activity, if you want to use that term. So what we see is, again, the red columns, the average between 2016 and 2020. There will be a slight reduction in those numbers because of the reduction in the amount of diving in 2020. But you can see that blue columns show much more activity, and in particular over the summer months, that's June to June to September, quite a significant level of activity over and above the rolling average. That there is, however, August is slightly depressed, and we're not sure why that is, but you'll see from some of the other statistics as we go through that there was a fairly clear difference from MCA and RNLI reports. So looking briefly at the sources of reports, and this is UK data only, then we've got a slight reduction in the or slight increase in the number of reports from the Coast Guard, and some of that was, we believe, related to the changing of the officers in the MCA responsible for reporting, and we picked up on a few incidents that were missed in the 2020 report that have been retrospectively added. But the RNLI reports are comparable. BSAC reports are slightly down, and there is some variation in the amount of media and other sources, some of which may have been reports that could have come in from BSAC members but didn't. But we use all sorts of sources. Media increasingly is more online sourcing rather than the press cutting service that we used to use. And then looking briefly at the types of UK incidents, I think the first thing of note here is that the number of ascent-related incidents, where the ascent is the fast, abnormal, missed stops, that kind of thing, is significantly down. And that doesn't mean to say that there aren't ascent-related elements within the other incidents, but we record the most serious consequence of an incident. But what we did in the early part of last year was, because of the expectations of coming out of the COVID restrictions, is we put a lot of effort into encouraging people to start off slowly, to get in the water in a controlled way and practice their skills. And I would like to think that that's reflected in the reduced number of ascents. Whereas the DCI and injury, which we tend to look at together, because of the way that the MCA and the RNLI in particular report things, it's not always clear whether or not it's DCI. So by looking at them together, they're pretty much comparable. So slight rise in the number of reported DCI, slight reduction in the number of injuries, but that varies year by year, where if we're uncertain, it's classed as an injury. If it's clearly somebody taken to a recompression chamber and actually treated, then clearly that's a DCI. And we don't try and guess, but by looking at them both together, it's on a par with the average in previous years. And then boating and surface incidents are slightly up, and not really easy to tell whether or not any of that is related to any lack of maintenance over the period. But we may find over the next couple of years whether or not there is an increasing trend that gives us some reason to reflect that. But we're uncertain. The only thing we can really say at this stage is that the number of reported incidents in boating and surface are slightly up. Fatalities are up slightly in relation to the rolling average, but we'll cover fatalities in a lot more detail later on. And then equipment, there is a reasonable rise there, and we speculate in the report whether or not this is anything to do with a lack of getting equipment checked and serviced before returning to diving or not, despite the fact that that was one of the characteristics that we pushed. And then miscellaneous does seem to have more than doubled. Miscellaneous are ones that don't fit any of the other categories, but the bulk of those increases are reports from the MCA and the RLI, where they simply report a false alarm with good intent, and so we record that. Because it has been reported as an incident, it resulted in an RLI call out, for example, and it reflects. I think it's valuable to reflect on the contribution that those organisations make, and if there is a safety message related to it, then if in doubt, don't hesitate to make the call. They aren't going to be critical. The key word here is with good intent, not with malicious intent. So looking at some of the Coast Guard assistance, again you see the curve of the sinusoidal curve that shows the normal trend, and what we've seen in the 2021 report is that the bulk of the incidents, 72% of the incidents recorded by the MCA occurred between June and the end of September. And some of that is reflective of the opportunity being taken to get back in the water again and to enjoy some reasonably good diving weather as well. But as we saw in the overall reports, there's this depression of what we would normally see in August, which we would expect that column to be higher. Helicopter involvement, which is usually indicative of either really serious incidents or incidents involved in call-outs to the MCA or the Coast Guard for DCI incidents, again is showing quite a significant impact over this June to September period. 81% of helicopter call-outs occurred in 2021 during that period. And then RLI, as you might expect, because they're closely working with the Coast Guard, is again 72% over that period, and this depression of the number of incidents in August. But there's also slightly less calling on the services of the RNLI in July, but I think that's partly correlated with more use of either shore-based services or helicopters at that time. So a slight depression in the use of RNLI assistance. So looking at the incident's maximum depth, the maximum depth of incidents, where we get that information, what we got in 2021 was quite a significant rise in the number of unknowns, and that was very much due to two of the major contributors to the data changing their systems on how they reported and actually not recording very much detail, and in particular the maximum depths of dives. Um, the, but what we did get was, so a significant increase in the unknowns, and also an increase in the surface, for a slightly related reason. So one of them is that where we didn't have any depths for the dives, but it resulted in a DCI, because we know that the DCI normally is identified on the surface, then that was recorded, and so that we believe that's the reason for some of that increase. But it's both of them are very much driven by the lack of information, but also, and some of the boat failures, but making reasonable inferences. So normally we only report on facts, but where it's reasonable to make an inference, then we have done so, and that's part of the reason for that. However, the next column is where we know the depths where incidents began, and they normally are associated with more detailed reports. So the unknown is really where we know the actual maximum depth of the dive, but not necessarily where the incident actually occurred. And the only significant element here is this increase in surface, and we believe this reflects the increase in DCI incidents, where, again, as I've already said, that's where we identify that if there isn't a reason for it, so if it resulted from a rapid ascent that started at a particular depth, then we can record that as the depth of the incident if it resulted in a DCI. But more often than not, the attribution to the trigger for the DCI isn't known, and so it's first described at the surface. Excuse me a sec. So moving on to fatalities, and tragically, during 2021, there was 16 recorded UK fatalities, recorded over 15 incidents. So one of those fatalities, sadly, was a double fatality. And in context, because we've always reported on the number of BSAC members and non-BSAC members then that are reflected in that, and that's recorded in the published report towards the back pages. There were 8 BSAC members that sadly lost their lives. But as you'll see in a moment, there's a lot of unknowns in the data, and in a lot of respects, this year, this reporting year, there's more than there usually is. But just looking at the periods when those fatalities occurred, the months, and it's always variable, but to some extent, it is reflective of the amount of diving that goes on. So what you would expect is where there's more diving, there will be more incidents, and more incidents there are, the potential for fatalities is greater. But what we saw is, as you might expect, very little diving in the early part of the year because of lockdown. But this June to September period is where the bulk of those fatalities are clustered. You don't get quite the same curve with this if you look at the rolling average, but June in particular was a very sad month with 5 tragic incidents. So what we normally do at this point is to look at the range of fatalities and the factors that are can be identified from some of them. And as I've already mentioned, the key thing amongst this is out of the 16 fatalities, so these columns will build up. Each column represents one diver who sadly died. And in 9 of those incidents, there's a very significant lack of information. And you know that's unfortunately the person who really knew what happened isn't around to help us. But what we try and do is look at factors and see what we can draw out of it. And as we've done many times before, is we've looked at the potential for medical factors, so natural causes being a factor, and what we've identified through existing coroner's inquests that have taken place, that 3 of them have been already confirmed as natural causes, and there's one where the characteristics mean that it's possible that might have been a factor. And as I'm sure you're all aware, we've been raising awareness about the potential for immersion pulmonary edema, and from the details that we've got, and particularly where we've got information, is that we've identified at the moment 5 of those incidents where some of the characteristics of immersion pulmonary edema may be implicated, and give us grounds to at least raise awareness that there is that potential. And unconsciousness in the water, you know, is again where it's identified as an actual factor, and I'll maybe come back to that in a minute. So just a brief reminder, I'm sure everybody is well aware of this, but just to repeat the issues around immersion pulmonary edema, there's a growing awareness worldwide about the potential seriousness of this problem. And so we're advising divers to pay attention for when they're diving, breathing difficulties without apparent reason, rapid uneven breathing, coughing uncontrollably, confusion, belief that a regulator is malfunctioning or that you're out of air when you really aren't, and having signalled that a diver is out of air, refusing or rejecting an alternate source when they're found to be working perfectly well, and difficulty breathing once on the surface. And the key messages are, if any of those things become apparent, then you know, without reason, then abort the dive, return to the surface as quickly and safely as possible, and if with your buddy. You know, in the past there have been clearly identifiable incidents where somebody has been showing those circumstances and not been escorted to the surface by their buddy for one reason or another, and found unconscious and not breathing on the surface with a delay and the subsequent attempts at rescue, and obviously, if in doubt, any instances like that, to seek medical advice. So going on to the next section. So separation was identified in 8 incidents from the information that we have available, and potentially one other as well, from one of the ones that we lack information on. Of those, 3 of those incidents involved trio or more, and all of those trios resulted in some form of separation. That's not to say that the separation was the cause of the incident, but as you'll see in a moment, there is a consequence. And then there was 2 incidents where there was an element of solo diving following the separation, and 2 others where it's not clear, but it's likely, in the very limited information that we've got, that there may have been an element of solo diving. But one of the unusual things this year, that's out of the ordinary, if you like, is that the amount of instances where divers were missing, i.e. they remained underwater for some period of time, and out of the 16 fatalities, 11 of them resulted in a missing diver, and they were missing for anywhere between a couple of minutes before they were refound and recovered to the surface, but unfortunately didn't survive, to a couple of days, ranging to several weeks, and in one instance, the diver is unfortunately still missing. Now that's unusual. Normally you wouldn't get that, but for me the key message there is that, particularly where it involves separation, then if you've got nobody to assist you, then there isn't, and you're unable to assist yourself, then the consequences can only be one thing, and the ability to recover people to the surface, as we showed a couple of years ago, and be able to put in place resuscitation efforts and everything, cannot be successful if they're missing and under the water. Again, unusually, but there may be more. There was a smaller number of rapid ascents involved than in previous years, so only 3 where we can clearly identify that there was a rapid ascent involved. But again, that relates back to the ascent-related issues and the reduction there. I think that is a part of the factor. And there's 3 instances where the diver actually being out of gas was found to be a factor either in triggering the fast ascent, for example, or attributable to the reason why the death occurred. And there was 3 instances that we know that the diver was using a rebreather, and 1 where we think it's highly likely, but we don't actually have the evidence at the moment. But that's not to say that the rebreather was the cause of the incident, simply that historically we've always recorded whether or not a CCR was being used, and the synopsis of the individual incidents will allow you to make your own assessment of how much involvement the rebreather had or otherwise. But I think it's useful to have some understanding of the involvement of particular types of equipment. And so some of the other areas, in terms of the broad types of incidents, so what we've done for a couple of years now is used the BSAC membership figures as a proxy for estimating the amount of participation in the sport. And from that allows us to extract the trend line shown here as a 5-year rolling average, and to try and draw some conclusions from that. So from the fatalities point of view, we've got a reasonably consistent straight line. That's not to say that, you know, any of those incidents are not an absolute tragedy for everybody concerned, but doesn't appear to be a significant change either up or down. So despite all the efforts that we make, that, you know, we're not reducing the background level of fatalities within diving incidents, but it's not going up either, although you could kind of say that, you know, there does seem to be a slight rise, but, you know, we'll keep monitoring it. On the other hand, DCI and ascent related incidents are or appear to be declining, and we believe that a lot of that is because of the continuing efforts to improve buoyancy control, improve awareness, and help people keep further away from the risk of DCI and an uncontrolled ascent. And from the point of view of the others, boating and surface incidents seem to be declining, but the others are more or less a steady background trend. Some variation, some going up and then coming back down again. Equipment, as we've seen this year, going up slightly, and that might warrant some more detailed analysis, but there isn't much that we can draw from that. So just some advice on using the incident report. So obviously the key thing is the report itself. This session has been about going through some of the analysis that's covered in the beginning of it. And as I've already said, this session recording will be available on the website later this next week. And what we would encourage people to do is not just to read the overall summary, but to take time and read the synopsis. It's the effort that goes into it is very much about making use of learning from other people's mistakes, misfortunes, unforeseeable circumstances, and help inform yourself, and if you're an instructor, help advise your students on how to avoid similar problems themselves, and understand some of the rationale for why the diver training program is the way it is, because it's designed to avoid the kind of problems that we experience here. And one of the safety sessions that we ran earlier this year was about how to make use of this, having club sessions where you pull out 2 or 3 incidents and look at them in some detail as a means of helping people draw out an understanding of the circumstances of a particular incident. The conclusions from the 2021 report, that we think that there is very clear, we've suspected for many, many years that the number of incidents is linked to the amount of diving taking place. Clearly 2020, very limited diving that could take place and a significant drop in the number of incidents. This year, the 2021 year, we believe that there was more diving taking place, but back towards at least the normal trend, and that gives us a degree of confidence that you know, the number of incidents is linked to the amount of diving taking place. The difficulty always is quantifying what that amount of diving actually is. But what we saw during 2021 was a slow start to the diving season, but overall for the year, the number of incidents is close to pre-pandemic levels. There is some evidence that equipment failure may be linked to the layoff and the deterioration of equipment and not perhaps being serviced in time. And very sadly, there was 16 fatalities in 15 reported incidents. Separation and solo diving are factors, and in particular, a significant number of missing divers. The final conclusion is that, and this is something that we've been saying pretty all the incident advisors since 1972, saying virtually the same things, that some of the incidents reported could have been avoided had people followed a few basic safe diving principles, following their training, being cautious, and exercising common sense, and all of the other things. And in addition, as we've reported on before, and we will report on again, is the efficacy of rescue capability, and many incidents have been prevented from escalation to more serious consequences by the application of rescue skills and support from buddy and the support from the emergency services. So if you haven't already, you can find the 2021 incident report at bsac.com/incident report, all one word. And I would encourage you to download a copy and read it. And so the last thing from me is reminder again about where you can download the report. But for those of you that don't visit the COVID safe diving section, then the link is there as well. And hopefully shortly that will be up and live and kicking. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jim.